The forest was vast, stretching in every direction, a dark sea of pine that whispered beneath the November wind. In northern Arizona, the Mogollon Rim rose like a rugged fortress, its rocky ridges and evergreen thickets shaping the destiny of the men who worked its slopes. Among the looming trees, life moved with the rhythm of chainsaws, sharpened blades, and rough laughter, a hard living carved from stubborn land. Yet even in such rugged country, where man measured himself against nature, the shadows sometimes seemed to hold more than trees. Looking back, it is easy to sense something uncanny tethered to that evening, an echo that still lingers in the silence between the pines. On November 5th, 1975, 7 men drove into those woods. They carried saws, axes, fuel canisters, and the calloused hands of loggers who knew the toll of labor, but also the camaraderie of shared hardship. Among them was Travis Walton, a 22-year-old with blue eyes as restless as the horizon. He had grown up in small-town Snowflake, and like his companions, he worked the forests out of necessity, not glamour. They were ordinary men, climbing out of an ordinary truck to perform an ordinary day's work. What unfolded as the sun fell, however, would render the term ordinary meaningless forever. The Arizona forest that day felt cold, but generous with late autumn's beauty. The needles carried the sharp tang of resin, and underfoot the earth exhaled a soft hush each time boots pressed against its surface. The men worked with the rhythmic clatter of machinery, voices shouting above the mechanical roar, a soundscape both harsh and strangely melodic. No one could have anticipated that a chapter of human folklore, one still fiercely debated decades later, was being written amidst those thuds and echoes. Sunset in the high country descends quickly, as though the earth pulls a heavy curtain across time's sky. That evening, shafts of fading light threaded through the branches, glowing amber one moment and vanishing the next. When the men finally packed their tools, there was no reason to suspect they would leave the forest in fear. Work was done, chainsaws silenced, and fuel cans tucked away. A truck door slammed, boots were shuffled, laughter muttered, and an engine rumbled awake. Headlights speared into the deepening dark. 7 men began their ride home, weary, yet satisfied. The story could have ended there. A simple logging crew heading back to Snowflake. But fate, or something beyond it, had other plans. Within minutes of bouncing along the rutted forest road, the men noticed a glow shimmering through the trees to their right. At first glance, it could have been a trick of sunset, or perhaps a fire stirring in the underbrush. But this light flickered with no ember's logic. It brightened, dimmed, then held steady, pure and strangely golden, unlike lantern or flame. The cab of the truck fell quiet. Each man knew the forest like a second skin, and nothing in its history explained such a sight. As they steered closer, the glow revealed itself not as distant fire, but as a hovering object, smooth and solid, suspended among the trees. It pulsed with silent authority, as though it were both alive and constructed. Some described it later as a disc, others as an oval, glittering metal yet exuding an almost organic presence. It bathed the clearing in an otherworldly radiance, washing pine needles in pale light. Few words passed between the men. They were caught in a trance of fascination and dread. Travis Walton, restless and curious by nature, felt an irresistible pull. While the others urged caution, he pushed open the door and stepped into the night. His boots pressed against the pine needles, crunching in deliberate stride as he moved into the clearing. He thought perhaps the light might drift away, vanish before their eyes, like some shared mirage. But as he edged closer, gaze fixed on the glowing hull, the impossible became solid. Then it happened. A bolt of energy flared from the craft, striking Travis with a blinding jolt. His body lifted, flung back as if his weight were nothing, spinning through the air before slamming hard to the ground. The glow hardened into brilliance, and the forest roared with silence. That strange silence where every heartbeat pounds louder than the world itself. Panic surged through the truck as his companions watched their friend collapse amid the flood of light. Survival, instinct, terror. They collided into one. Without looking back, the 6 remaining men roared away, the tires clawing at dirt and stone, scattering gravel behind them, as though they might outpace the incomprehensible. A man had vanished, or so it seemed, in the unlikely glow of Arizona's wilderness. The greatest controversy in modern abduction lore had just been born, but when we pause here, held in this moment before explanation, we encounter the beginning of a Kamala, mystery still debated. Did Travis Walton truly vanish into the confines of a craft not of this earth? Or did imagination, panic, and pressure weave a story too extraordinary to challenge? Believers would argue that such testimony carries an undeniable ring of truth, born from men too ordinary to conspire. Skeptics counter that fear can craft illusions as vivid as reality, that collusion and error distort truth more easily than the human mind acknowledges. Both perspectives jostle for prominence in the stillness of that clearing, where a flash of light altered lives and confounded judgment. From this moment, the tale divides. To one side, the awe and enduring loyalty of those who felt they witnessed something beyond understanding. To another, the suspicion of hoax, trickery, or delusion. The case would be interrogated, dissected, and paraded before polygraphs, psychologists, and public opinion. But before those stages unfolded, there remained the basic, undeniable fact. Travis Walton was gone. What did these men see? How can ordinary loggers produce a story now anchored in both UFO culture and American folklore? The Arizona night, cloaked in chill and pine-scented mist, whispers no answers. And yet, through half a century, people continue to wonder, probe, and challenge their own convictions. In November 1975, a mystery emerged, not with grand declarations, but with a single flash of strange light among the trees, and the disappearance of a young man driven by curiosity. The story would travel far beyond the pine woods, but it began here, in the hush of nightfall, in the last breath of day over the Mogollon Rim, where 7 men returned to town with terror in their eyes and silence pressing against their tongues. Those who believed them claimed an extraordinary truth had slipped into ordinary lives. Those who doubted saw a different tale. Confusion transfigured into mythology. Yet no matter which lens you chose, the event could not be dismissed. Stories of forest labor rarely echo through decades, but this one does, precisely because it skirts the edge of reality itself. So we step deeper into the mystery. A young man vanished to the chorus of engines and cries, his body thrown by a blinding force. His friends fled, fearing both for him and themselves. Something hovered among the darkening trees, something radiant, incomprehensible, and unyielding to explanation. And therein lies the true hook, the moment where belief and disbelief collide, leaving us balanced between what is known and what is possible. Snowflake, Arizona, was not a town designed for legends. It was a place that sat gently against the desert, a quilt of modest homes, church steeples, and ranch land, stitched together by roads, dusty in summer and icy in winter. The mountains watched quietly in the distance, their pines forming a green wall separating the valley town from the wilderness beyond. Residents moved about their lives with the patience of people who knew both hardship and endurance. Daily rhythms were steady, dependable, and practical, qualities demanded by the land itself. In 1975, Snowflake's population numbered only a few thousand. It was, by most measures, an unremarkable town to the outside world. But for those who lived there, including the Walton family, it carried weight, familiarity, tradition, and a network of relationships that lent meaning to long days of labor. Travis Walton was one among many young men who carved their existence from the rugged soil and timber of northern Arizona. He had grown up under wide skies, with chores that kept him lean and a wild curiosity that often made his gaze wander beyond the town's boundaries. Friends described him as contemplative, sometimes restless, yet loyal to those who shared his path. Travis's connection with the outdoors was typical for someone from Snowflake. Logging crews were a backbone of the region's economy, responsible for feeding the mills that translated pine into lumber for homes across the American West. Work began early, when dawn still clung pale and cold over the rim, and continued until exhaustion emptied out every muscle. The Walton family, like so many others, lived in houses built by perseverance and sweat, where hard work was less an option and more a certainty. To truly understand the magnitude of that November evening, one must first step into the ordinariness of what preceded it. Life for Travis and his friends was demanding, but far from unusual in their world. Men carpooled in pickup trucks that rattled like tin cans, rode out to the forest, and spent hours felling timber in the constant negotiation between human strength and stubborn earth. The work was dangerous. Saws could buck, trees could fall unpredictably, but most loggers grew used to that risk, accepting it as the background hum of their profession. The crew to which Travis belonged was tightly knit, not only because they shared danger, but also because they shared the intimate landscape of small-town life. Families overlapped, church pews connected them each Sunday, and local gatherings reminded them of how interwoven their lives truly were. They teased each other, loaned one another spare fuel or tools, celebrated milestones, and sometimes argued about trivial matters. But beneath all that ran a quiet brotherhood of survival. Timber work demanded cooperation. If someone faltered in judgment while handling a saw or guiding a tree's fall, lives could be lost. Trust was not optional. It was woven into their daily routines. On the morning of November 5th, 1975, the men piled into their international pickup truck, as they had countless times before. The air was crisp. Arizona's high country carved sharp cold into lungs at dawn, even if sunrise promised warmth later in the day. Their breath puffed pale clouds, and clothing layered thick kept them from stiffening too quickly in the chill. Beards grown from laziness or practicality framed faces weathered by sun and years outdoors. Inside the truck, conversations shifted easily. Jokes, mild complaints, loose talk about plans for the weekend. The creak of seats and smell of gasoline blended into one long prelude to routine labor. In those ordinary exchanges lay the heart of this story's grounding. These were not dreamers proposing wild tales of the cosmos. They were men concerned with wages, with dinner waiting at home, with the cigars and cigarettes tucked into shirt pockets. For Travis, that day was much like any other. His thoughts might have wandered to his girlfriend, to the strain of work, or to the way he felt driven to prove himself. No one then could have suspected he would become something else entirely, a man forever linked with a story skeptics and believers will puzzle over. The worksite for that day stood not far from the town, but deep enough within the forest to feel isolated. pines crowded against the narrow path, needles gathering thickly like a blanket across the earth. The rim country offered both beauty and menace. It was a land of long canyons, sudden drops, and jagged stone hidden beneath foliage. To work in such hills was to constantly place one's body amidst hazard, but for the crew, it had become second nature. Their leader, Mike Rogers, was both boss and companion. He worked fiercely, fought through obstacles, and carried responsibility heavily upon his shoulders. A contract with the Forest Service meant each day counted. To miss deadlines was to risk both income and credibility. And with so much on the line, the crew knew discipline and persistence mattered. Travis respected Rogers, though he was not always above grumbling about the constant pressure. This tension between loyalty and complaint, friendship and work duty, was typical of their relationship and underscored the authenticity of what would later unfold. As machines whined and sawdust sprayed into the chilled morning, each man settled into rhythm. There was Carl, steady and quiet, who kept to himself, but always finished more work than expected. There was Dwayne, a friend of Travis since childhood, who held a quiet trust with him that required little spoken confirmation. Others filled out the team, brothers, cousins, neighbors, all bound together by circumstance. They shouted instructions, muttered curses, and counterbalanced each other's movements. Chainsaws shrieked in steady bursts, metal bit through wood grain, and the canyon echoed with a chorus of men at work. By noon, sweat dampened collars despite the brisk air. Cutting trees required a brute will, but it also required calculation, each trunk angled to fall safely. Crews took short breaks, sharing snacks, leaning against boulders. When Travis stretched out to rest, he would sometimes glance into the distances where sky met evergreen and ponder how far horizons might carry him. But nothing about this day felt unusual enough to prelude what would soon follow. The ordinariness of that day is crucial. Historians and skeptics often search for fractures in the story, ways in which the men might have concocted it. Yet everything before the encounter reads as routine to the point of banality. It was this ordinariness that later gave believers reason to trust the tale. Men who talked about broken saw blades, damp matches, and stale coffee were unlikely, they argued, to collectively generate one of history's most debated UFO accounts without some catalyst. As shadows began their gradual creep across the forest floor, time played its steady trick. Hours vanished in the blur of effort. The sun arced behind clouds, burst occasionally through branches, then bent toward horizon. Autumn nights come early in mountain country, wrapping the landscape in long slants of gold before pressing everything into premature darkness. The men were tired, their muscles sore, yet their contract weighed on them. Just few more cuts, a few more trees. The camaraderie of the crew displayed itself in small ways. A shared thermos of coffee, a hand offered to steady climbing boots, a joke lightening heavy silence. Each man depended on the other, but that sense of connection existed without need for constant expression. Within such groups, loyalty is assumed. The thought of betrayal or dishonesty between them seemed inconceivable at the time, though ironically, accusations of collusion would later define their reputations. As the final trees for the day toppled with thunderous cracks, the crew began the process of cleaning up. Chainsaws were silenced, blades cooled, fuel was stowed, and jackets zipped higher as temperature dropped with sudden finality. The men performed these rituals with muscle memory, knowing how quickly chill encroached once the sun dipped. Understanding Travis's character in this frame paints him as perfectly human, hardworking enough to avoid ridicule, restless enough to chase curiosity, and loyal enough to his friends to stand beside them through harsh conditions. He was no hero searching for extraordinary purpose, merely a man navigating the delicate balance of youth, responsibility, and yearning. This very ordinariness, the boy from a small mountain town, the man among 7 ordinary co-workers, lies at the heart of why his story matters. Whether hoax, hallucination, or genuine encounter, the transformation of such a figure into the subject of global speculation is precisely what makes it absorbent. Followers of the tale point to his lack of motive for fabrication. What fame, they ask, could a logger possibly chase? Skeptics, of course, counter differently, suggesting a scheme to escape penalties of contract failure or a chance at momentary adventure, spun too far. Both interpretations pivot on the foundation of the day itself, a day that was, in every regard, routine. The ride home that evening began as so many before it had. The pickup filled with chatter and exhaustion, humor muted by muscles sore from hours of labor. Some thought about food ahead awaiting them, about television sets glowing in warm living rooms, about wives or girlfriends preparing to ask how long the job would continue. Tires crunched over gravel, shocks jostled with each pothole, and conversation fell in and out like waves against rocks. Among them sat Travis, not remarkable in this setting, simply another weary worker looking forward to warmth, a meal, and eventual rest. How fragile routine becomes in light of what followed. Had they driven that path 100 times? Likely. Did they expect to see that glow among the trees? Never. Yet without the picture of this day, this ordinary November afternoon, we lose the scale of transformation that awaited. Without ordinariness, there is no contrast, and contrast is the key. When a shining craft lights the forest and a young man steps forward, it matters precisely because such events erupt not in a sci-fi stage set, but in the mud, sweat, and familiarity of lives locked in routine. The day before the darkness was, by every measure, unexceptional, which is why it resonates so strongly when examined through decades of hindsight. Among the pines of Arizona, 7 men conducted their work. They packed their tools at dusk. They climbed into their truck. They started back toward lights of Snowflake, with laughter fading and fatigue overwhelming. It was common enough, typical enough. And then the glow shifted their path. The story fractured ordinary life in half, before and after. Before, Snowflake's known rhythms of labor. After, a flash of radiant energy and a missing man. But to fully understand the extraordinary, you must walk first through the ordinary. To feel the surreal rupture, you must see the normalcy it desperately is. Only then can you weigh this story with your own measure of belief or skepticism. Thus, the day before darkness stands not merely as a placeholder in chronology, but as a stage of human texture. It is the soil into which the extraordinary root sank. And whether you see that root as real or imagined, it grew only because the ground was ordinary. The ride back toward Snowflake was a lull of ordinary sound. The rattle of the international pickup, boots shifting on the floor, muttered reflections after a long day. Outside, the Arizona twilight had folded itself across the landscape, transforming pines into long black silhouettes. The sun was already below the horizon, leaving a faint burn of lavender and copper behind the rim. Darkness in those woods never descended softly. It took over in sudden breaths, sucking light into itself until the only visibility came from headlights slicing narrow tunnels through trees. Yet this evening, with an ordinary shift behind them and fatigue weighing their frames, the men expected nothing more than a late dinner and a warm bed. It began subtly, almost as if the forest wanted to whisper before it shouted. Ahead, and just off the roadside, An unusual glow shimmered faintly through the trees. At first, no one commented. The truck's engine masked the softer cues of light's intrusion. But the glow grew as they advanced, not flickering like fire, not diffused like moonlight, but sharp and self-contained, steady as a lantern, yet brightening with each jolt of the truck forward. Mike Rogers, driving, leaned closer to the windshield. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles pale in dim cabin light. "What's that?" someone muttered. The glow was no reflection, no hunter's campfire. It loomed just off the dirt road and up ahead, swaying faintly as though suspended in a hidden gravity. Conversation dwindled. Weary chatter gave way to silence thick with apprehension. The air inside the truck seemed to contract. The noise of the engine and tires competed with a rising awareness of something deeply unusual awaiting them. The men squinted into the tree line, disbelief composing itself on every face. As the truck crested closer, it came into full sight. Hovering just above the ground in a small clearing, partially shielded by branches, a curved metallic object glowed with its own light. To some, it looked like an oval. To others, later, like a disc cut smooth against the dim backdrop of forest. The skin of the craft was neither dull nor mirrored. It was something in between, like burnished metal capturing starlight. Its glow painted the surrounding rough bark and pine needles in hues of amber and silver. The phenomenon was silent. Not the buzz of generators, not the roar of motors. The stillness wrapped the soundscape so tightly that the hum of the men's own breathing seemed magnified. Travis Walton's heart raced faster than the truck. He could not look away. There, manifest in undeniable presence, was something he had never dared to imagine standing before. Not from a television set, not from whispered tales, but with his own living eyes. Against his better judgment, he felt compelled, lifted by a magnetic curiosity. The truck slowed as the crew debated, but Travis had already made his choice before anyone could protest. He pushed open the door, swung his boots to the earth, and stepped down into the night. His footsteps fell soft on the hay, out of pine needles, brushing the forest floor. Crisp air washed over his face, sharpening every sensation. The pungency of resin, the fragile snap of twigs beneath his soles, the rising warmth of blood rushing in his ears. He stood in the clearing, staring directly at the object. Light pulsed gently, as though the craft were a living organism, breathing in slow, deliberate rhythm. Its glow did not blaze aggressively, but rather bathed its surroundings in even luminance, settling upon Travis as if marking him. Behind him, the truck's engine rumbled uneasy, the crew shouting after him with pleas and warnings. Fear stiffened their bodies, the kind of primal fear that made knees tremble against reason. To approach was lunacy, they thought. To stay was danger. Yet Travis, whether reckless or entranced, ignored them. He advanced several steps. The object hung there, hovering in perfect stability, not tilting or wavering despite the absence of visible support. Its edges rounded smooth, geometry too precise for natural origin, yet too strange for human familiarity. As he reached the core of the clearing, his head tilted back. The craft loomed perhaps 20 feet above ground, large enough to dominate perception, but not vast enough to swallow sky. He raised a hand instinctively, shielding his eyes from the brightness that grew as he moved toward it. A warmth prickled against his skin, not burning but penetrating, like the heat of the sun diffused by clouds. Time seemed to compress in this moment. Seconds slowed into grains of eternity. His crew's shouts grew muffled, as though carried from a great distance. Then, without audible prelude, the silence thundered into a sudden eruption. A beam of brilliant white-blue energy shot from the craft's underside, striking Travis directly in the chest. The The light was blinding, sharp as a welder's flame, saturating the forest until every trunk, every fallen branch, every face inside the truck was overexposed into ghost-like clarity. Travis's body lifted violently into the air, arms flinging wide, torso buckling under the invisible force. He hung suspended for a fraction of time, then slammed backward, sprawling onto the forest floor. His limbs sprawled awkwardly, motionless within the halo of brightness. The beam withdrew as suddenly as it came, collapsing back into the craft with clinical finality. Inside the truck, panic ignited. The crew screamed. Some swore they saw his body convulse. Others swore his chest ceased rising altogether. The great glow of the craft intensified ever so slightly, as though preparing to act further. Instinct made the decision for them. Rogers slammed the accelerator, and the truck lunged forward. Tires spun dirt into wild spirals, headlights swinging as the vehicle bolted away from the clearing and down the path. Fear yanked every man into silence. Breath ragged, eyes wide, minds refusing comprehension. The wind hissed against open windows, air rushing by faster as the truck careened down the mountain road. Behind them, in the clearing, Travis had vanished from their company, his prone shape left in the unnatural glow. The sight of him being struck replayed across their shock-blinded minds, burning itself into each memory. They argued briefly, fragmented bursts of guilt and self-preservation colliding. Should they return? Should they call for help? Was he alive or already dead? The confusion fed terror until rational thought fractured entirely. What lingered most powerfully, even later retold, was the silence of the craft. No roar, no whirring blades or jets, no thunderous crash of ignition. Only silence, profound and otherworldly, as though the forest itself had fallen under spell. The absence of sound became, paradoxically, its loudest quality. For Travis, in that instant when the beam struck, consciousness dissolved into confusion. Light engulfed him. The pine Siiki-san, overed earth, fell away. Warmth surged through his chest, too intense for ordinary sensation. Fear overwhelmed comprehension, his body a ragdoll lifted by invisible forces. The outlines of the forest dissolved, edges blurred, awareness frayed into darkness. Whether seconds or minutes followed, whether his body lay on cold soil or carried elsewhere, was beyond his knowing. Only the memory of that beam's searing strike carved itself into permanence. Meanwhile, in the truck's frenzy, arguments broke out. Rogers, gripping the wheel with trembling hands, insisted escape was the only option. Another pressed for courage to return, to help their fallen friend. Their voices fractured into breathless exclamations and denials. The men were bonded by years of work, but fear had cut a chasm down the middle of their unity. Rational judgment had been devoured by primal instinct. To stay near the object was unthinkable. To abandon Travis, unforgivable. They found themselves caught between those unbearable choices while the truck barreled further from the source of their nightmare. Only later, when exhaustion and shame forced them to slow, did the idea of turning back resurface fully. The men sat, engine idling, debating in shaken voices whether they had just witnessed something supernatural, technological, or imagined, but none could erase the sight. Travis, blasted by energy, sprawled helpless on the ground. Nothing could erase the shimmering craft, levitating silently, unchanged by their chaos. Skeptics years later would analyze their testimonies, search for inconsistencies, weigh their fear against plausibility. Yet in that moment, all that mattered was survival and the raw belief that they had wandered into the heart of something utterly beyond them. Here in this clearing, the mystery cements itself. Humanity thrives on binaries, real or fake, truth or trick, science or fantasy. But the encounter denied easy classification. Light existed in strange secrecy. A man fell by its hand, and 6 others fled from what they could not grasp. Believers read the account and see validation of countless whispered stories passed down in UFO lore. Skeptics read the same lines and frame them as testimony born of fear, a hoax sculpted by men escaping contract resentment or sharing a moment of collective delusion. Both interpretations lean heavily on the clearing, on that radiant, silent craft, and the man who stepped too near. The clearing itself remains a place of quiet contradiction. On the surface, it is like countless spots scattered through rim country. Pine needles drifting against soil, rock protruding through tangled roots, the smell of turpentine sharp as if exhaled by trees themselves. Nothing in its shape or soil suggests it could birth one of history's most contested narratives. Yet it is precisely this contrast, common landscape versus extraordinary sight, that gives the tale its magnetic force. For what is more haunting than the collision of the Ord, ein Airy, with the impossible? Years later, visitors have stood in that very clearing, gazing up through the branches where the craft reportedly hovered. Some say they feel vibrations or uneasy pressure, as though the forest itself preserved trauma in its marrow. Others see only trees and soil unchanged, dismissing mythology embroidered atop wilderness. But for the 7 men of 1975, that clearing was forever marked. Travis's choice to approach was as human as it was bold. Curiosity drives us forward, even when fear restrains. For skeptics, his reckless charge suggests a man courting drama or inviting danger. For believers, it is the act of someone compelled by forces subtler than reason, drawn magnetically into encounter. Regardless of conclusion, his approach marks the turning point where routine life slipped irreversibly into folklore, where night's silence, shattered by a beam, changed relationships, careers, and imagination. And so, the scene rests. The glowing craft, pale and precise in the dark pines. A young man stepping forward, despite desperate pleas. A flash of impossible energy. A body flung like a doll onto forest earth. A crew panicking, fleeing. The echoes of their shouting drowned by silence deeper than sound. This central encounter is the seed of everything that follows. The search parties, the polygraphs, the cultural echoes, the decades of argument. But even stripped of context, it endures powerfully. For it asks a question each listener must reckon with quietly. If you were seated in that truck, would you have stepped forward into light or sat paralyzed by dread? If you saw your friend collapse beneath strange power, would you have stayed to help or fled into night with survival clawing at your chest? The clearing offers no answers, only the flicker of memory suspended forever in time, where trees leaned over witnesses, where silence carried weight heavier than thunder, where a man vanished under a flood of radiant energy. And so we leave the clearing, carrying its image into the chapters ahead, knowing that whatever explanation we seek, alien visitation, hoax, hallucination, or some mixture thereof, it must always begin with this moment. November 5th, 1975, Arizona pine country, twilight folding over logging roads, and a craft glowing silently in the woods. Snowflake's warmth had seemed so close when the crew began their drive home. But now, with Travis left behind in the clearing, home felt like a horizon that no longer existed. The men's voices rose and tangled in the cab of the truck, panic bubbling through every sentence. The image of their friend struck down by an impossible beam replayed on endless loops in their minds. Some swore he had been killed instantly. Others insisted he had been alive, only unconscious. They argued and shouted, yet no matter the conclusion, none could shake the dread that clutched their chests. Fear was visceral, animal, sharper than the chainsaws they handled daily. And unlike timberwork, this fear had no harness, no gauge. It offered no clear way forward. At last, Rogers slowed the truck. Dusk dispersed in pale swirls behind them as he pulled onto the side of the forest road. The silence after the abrupt stop was suffocating. No one wanted to step outside. The night seemed charged, vibrating in ways that could not be explained. In hushed voices, they debated whether to go back. Cowardice and courage warred in every thought. To return was to face the thing again, but to leave was to abandon a friend. Time ticked uselessly. Some men begged Rogers to deliver them to safety first, to drop them in town before returning for Travis. Others demanded they all go back together. The compromise was fragile, stitched more by guilt than confidence. They decided to circle around, to at least look toward the clearing, though most doubted they could gather courage to stop. The truck's headlights swung wildly as they turned. Their path dragged them closer to the place where seconds earlier they had witnessed the extraordinary. Nerves prickled. Every shadow of tree limbs looked suspicious. When they reached the clearing once more, the glow was gone. Only darkness waited beneath the pines. The place looked ordinary, unchanged, except something about that very ordinariness felt sinister, as if the forest had conspired to swallow evidence whole. They shouted Travis's name into the emptiness, their voices trembling. No reply bounced back. No movement stirred beneath the trees. They searched the ground half-heartedly, their eyes darting constantly skyward, half expecting the craft to return. Finally, terror overwhelmed any sense of duty. They retreated again, piling into the truck, retreating toward town with heavier silence than before. Back in Snowflake, news spread fast. Families met them with alarm and confusion. "Where's Travis?" was the first and only question on everyone's lips. When Rogers explained fragments of the story, the bright craft, the beam, the fall, a hush of disbelief curled into the room. The loggers' faces bore no hint of playfulness. Each man's wide eyes betrayed trauma. Yet, to outside ears, layered with shock and suspicion, the account sounded impossible. Within hours, search parties began organizing. Rogers and the surviving men accompanied law enforcement back toward the rim. Deputies expected to find something tragic, but earthly. Perhaps an accident, a logging mishap spun into hysteria, or, at worst, foul play disguised by fantasy. Sheriff's vehicles lit up narrow roads, radios crackled, flashlights cut jittery beams across pine and stone. They combed the clearing where Rogers said Travis had fallen. But again, nothing. No scorch marks, no fragments of craft, no body, only silence. The forest became both ally and enemy in the search. Its density offered cover, swallowing sound and light. Dozens of volunteers scoured ridges and ravines. The terrain was unforgiving, steep drops hidden in thickets, cold air biting fingers and cheeks, shouts carried in every direction. "Travis!" But the name dissolved into night without reply. Suspicion sharpened quickly. To local authorities, stories of glowing discs did not align with law enforcement training. What did align, tragically, were cases of workplace tempers flaring into fights, friends protecting each other's secrets, men weaving tales to cover darker deeds. The sheriff pressed Rogers and the others for different explanations. If Travis had been struck by a tree, an accident, or even a fight. Now was the time to admit it. Yet the men repeated the same details. The light, the crack, the beam. Whispers spread through town. Had the men killed Travis in some drunken quarrel? Had they abandoned him after an accident? Families whispered in kitchens, long after dishes were clear, weighing every possibility. Others speculated about the extraordinary, that the men saw what they claimed, no matter how implausible. But with each passing hour, Travis remained missing. Pressure mounted against his companions. Investigators pursued the matter with urgency. Polygraph tests were arranged, focusing on one question: had they harmed Travis? Sitting in front of the machine's wires and sensors, each man answered, his nerves exposed already by the trauma of the night. Most results indicated honesty, with only slight inconsistencies attributable to stress. For authorities, this complicated the puzzle. These were not criminals failing under scrutiny. These were shaken men showing signs of truthfulness, despite telling what seemed an unimaginable story. But still the question lingered, echoing across searchers, townspeople, journalists, and skeptics alike. Could ordinary men fabricate such a tale under pressure? The phrasing itself rippled outward. On one hand, fabrication was possible. They might have invented a dazzling cover story. On the other, the very ordinariness of the men, their lack of fame, sophistication, or prior imagination, lent weight to believers' trust. Why would 7 loggers, bound by contracts and modest lives, risk reputations forever on such a bizarre invention? As days stretched on, grief cut deeper. The Walton family bore the worst of it. Travis's mother, stoic yet quietly grieving, kept to herself, avoiding reporters who had already begun arriving with questions. Brothers and cousins searched side by side with deputies. Each night, emptiness returned with them. Meanwhile, the theories multiplied. UFO researchers began injecting themselves into the narrative, explaining how Travis's experience aligned with previous abduction cases. Skeptics leaned into psychological explanations, perhaps group hysteria, a stress-induced hallucination, or the desperate cover for a tragedy. The townsfolk themselves split along the fault line. Some believed wholeheartedly, others mocked, the word hoax muttered in diners and barbershops. Snowflake, once an anonymous town, suddenly swirled with the weight of national attention. The men of the crew faced ridicule, even while searching. Deputies tracked their movements relentlessly, hoping cracks might emerge in their accounts. But their story remained consistent. A glow, a crack, a beam, a fallen comrade. If they disagreed on details, it was in descriptions of size, shape, or intensity. But such variances are common in high-stress events. On the central truth, they align. Travis was struck by light and vanished. By now, reporters began flocking in. Microphones, cameras, scribbled notebooks. Journalists sought sound bites, angles, evidence of scandal. The loggers were simple men, unaccustomed to such attention. Their nervous stuttering, their weary eyes, their reluctance to grandstand only heightened division. Some derided them as rural simpletons duped by delusion. Others saw them as credible, precisely because they lacked polish. Meanwhile, snow threatened the rim country as the nights grew colder. Search parties pressed deeper into ravines, convinced a body might lie hidden. Helicopters swept, T-head overhead, dogs sniffed trails, and law enforcement mapped the terrain, grid by grid. Yet the clearing yielded nothing. No corpse, no tracks beyond those made by the men themselves. Absence became the strangest evidence of all. Guilt and sorrow suffocated the men. Some lay awake through nights, hearing again the soundless flash, the moment their friend crumpled. Others replayed the decision to drive away, weighing whether another choice might have saved him. They confessed resentment at themselves, but also lingering terror. Would the craft have destroyed them all if they had stayed? Was Travis, in that instant, already beyond human help? There were no answers, only haunted silence and the unmovable fact of a missing man. On the fourth day, rumors began claiming hoax outright. Journalists asked, had the men staged disappearance to avoid penalties on their Forest Service contract? Had they concocted the tale as an elaborate prank? Those who knew the crew balked at such ideas. The men were far from amateur playwrights. They could barely speak comfortably to reporters, let alone devise intricate deception that could withstand polygraph scrutiny. But suspicion thrives in absence, and with Travis still gone, speculation only widened. What perhaps stung most was the accusatory gaze of fellow townsfolk. Snowflake was small. Suspicion turned social circles brittle. Church friends eyed them differently. Employers hesitated around their names. Children whispered at school. The loggers themselves pulled inward, refusing elaborate embellishment, insisting always on the same plain recounting. That steadiness reassured some, irritated others, and baffled investigators. 5 days passed. Exhaustion gripped the Walton family, authorities, and the crew alike. Each night, when the search grew cold and the forest returned to stillness, the universe felt as though it mocked them with silence. If he were dead, where was his body? If alive, why no sign? The answers refused arrival. And then, only when despair seemed permanent, Travis returned. It would have been simpler had he emerged from the woods dazed but intact, but his reappearance sparked more fire than closure. Found near a highway gas station, confused, shaking, speaking of bright light and strange beings. His testimony lit anew the division between belief and disbelief. What followed? His telling of time aboard the craft, the examinations, the way his friends clung to or distanced themselves from details, would become a chapter expanding the mystery. Yet it is essential to pause here, in the days of absence, to understand why the case became legend. Because it is here, in the uncertainty, that the fire grew hottest. Before explanations, before narratives calcified, what truly defined Snowflake was this: a young man was missing. 6 companions told a story that defied comprehension. Investigators pressed them with suspicion, and the community wrestled with an unbearable choice. Were these men murderers hiding in plain sight? Were they fools spinning lies? Or had they indeed brushed the edges of something extraordinary, never meant for human eyes? The days without Travis, stained by sleepless nights, search dogs baying, and whispered accusations, built the crucible in which the Walton case was forged. The absence itself became its own encounter, a liminal space where explanation faltered, where families paced homes praying, and where ordinary loggers discovered themselves suspended between scorn and wonder. Even now, nearly half a century later, this frame of the story remains pivotal. For while the craft and the beam define spectacle, it is the missing time, the endless questions that sculpted legend. For legend does not live in what is proved. It thrives in what is uncertain. Could ordinary men fabricate such a tale under pressure? Perhaps, perhaps not. The truth teeters eternally between both, balanced upon a November night when one of their new ember vanished into silence, and the world rushed in to fill the void with doubt, suspicion, and curiosity. Darkness gave way to light in ways Travis had never imagined possible. He would later describe the sensation as if waking from unconsciousness into a reality that barely resembled waking at all. When the beam struck him in the clearing, his thoughts collapsed into nothingness. Then, slowly, awareness seeped back. Not in the comforting familiarity of pine-tinged air or rocky soil, but in a place silent, sterile, and unlike any realm of Earth. In his first moments of regained consciousness, panic ruled. His body felt heavy yet unstable, his vision warped by dazzling brightness. He struggled to adjust, coughing against air dense and clinical, with a subtle metallic tang. He was lying flat, his muscles sluggish as though paralyzed by lingering electricity. Fear pressed into every corner of his awareness. What had happened in those missing seconds? Where was he now? As his eyes sharpened, shapes formed above him. The ceiling hovered low, curved smoothly, seamless like molded plastic or polished metal. Light came not from fixtures, but from the very surface itself, radiating evenly across the room, as though walls and ceiling were designed to glow. Travis at first assumed he was in a hospital. The brightness and table beneath him evoked surgery, and his memory, fragmented and desperate, grasped toward the familiar. Perhaps he had survived an accident. Perhaps authorities had retrieved him. Perhaps white-coated doctors were now at his side. But when he turned his gaze, expectation collided with shock. 3 figures stood near him, small in stature, no taller than 4 or 5 feet. Their heads seemed oversized for their fragile frames, tapering into smooth domes that melded into necks almost too narrow to bear the weight. Their skin, pale as candle wax, carried no clear texture like pores or wrinkles. Eyes were their most overwhelming feature, dark, expansive, encompassing half the face, reflecting light with glossy emptiness. Noses and mouths, if they could be called that, were faintly etched, minimal creases rather than full features. They wore simple suits, tan or orange, seamless, without belts or seams, to suggest human tailoring. The figures moved with deliberate grace, coordinated without speaking, their gazes fixed on Travis with unreadable intent. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though a specimen brought alive under strange scrutiny. Instinct surged against logic. He leapt to his feet. A surge of adrenaline overcame his stiffness, and he staggered backward, his eyes darting for escape routes. He shouted words that cracked harshly against the stale air, though no reply answered. Still, the beings moved closer. Their short legs carried them smoothly around the table. Their hands, if so they could be called, appeared delicate, with long, fine fingers, lacking nails or knuckles as humans possess. Travis's terror peaked. He reached wildly with trembling hands, finding a rod-like object resting near the table. What seemed like a metallic cylinder or bar, just heavy enough to wield as defense. He swung it violently, a feral act of desperation. The figures retreated, not with anger or aggression, but with a calm yielding. They drifted from the room, their gazes unwavering until they vanished through a portal-like doorway. Travis's breath heaved, pulse thundered in his temples. For minutes, or seconds that only felt like eternity, he stood trembling, weapon raised toward the emptiness. The silence was near perfect, disturbed only by his ragged gasp. Chunks. When at last no beings returned, his fear began transforming into something stranger. Curiosity. Where was he? The room itself radiated sterility. Walls gleamed in uniform material, neither painted metal nor stone. It bore no bolts, no seams, no imperfections. He scanned the surfaces and found no doors in human sense. only panels that seemed to dissolve when pressed. Light shifted slightly, adjusting as if alive. When he pressed one wall, it responded with a subtle ripple, as though the boundaries of the room were designed to yield. He wandered down a corridor, revealed reluctantly as he explored. The hallway curved as though wrapped around the craft's circumference. Surfaces retained the same glow, soft and shadowless. Strange symbols appeared, faintly etched along some panels, not carved, but embedded in the very surface. They flickered briefly as he brushed past, harder to interpret than the most arcane mathematics. At length, he entered another chamber, larger, hollow in its center. In place of furniture stood a single high-backed chair, angular and gleaming. Arrays of controls or displays curved before it, small lights pulsing in colors he could not fully describe. He approached cautiously, his survival instinct still roaring, yet tempered by wonder at the strangeness. The air hummed almost imperceptibly, as though the craft itself were alive. When he dared touch one of the surfaces, a sudden rush of star-filled imagery burst across his senses. It was as though the machinic shell had given him a window to the universe. Dots of light scattered across vastness, swirls of nebulae, trajectories that traced invisible paths. He could not tell if he walked among these vistas or only perceived them within his mind. Awe pinned him in place. For an instant, the terror eased, eclipsed by immensity, but the wonder did not erase longing. Too human to detach, his thoughts yearned for home, for friends, for the simplicity of Snowflake's rugged earth. Fear crept back in, reminding him he was a trespasser in a place beyond belonging. It was then a new figure entered, a being distinct from the small ones who had first surrounded him. This one appeared taller, more human-like, with features partially familiar, a jawline, hair framing a face, and proportions echoing earthly humans. Dressed in a suit, radiant and seamless, this figure's presence calmed him rather than stoked terror. The being extended its hand or arm with quiet serenity, beckoning for him to follow. Exhaustion weakened his resistance. Travis allowed himself to be led along another corridor into still another chamber, its space vast and dome-like. He recalled curves stretching overhead, translucent panels yielding glimpses of celestial constellations. He lay stunned at the vision, the universe unfurling itself within reach. But even this beauty could not steady his panic completely. Communication remained absent. Attempts to speak were met only with silence. Yet the taller beings, more human-like in appearance, seemed watchful rather than predatory. He struggled between fear and a seed of reassurance. Eventually, his memory fragmented. He would later recall lying once again on a surface, brightness pouring down upon him, faces hovering above as though intent on studying him further. His consciousness frayed like fabric unraveling along hidden seams. When awareness finally snapped back fully, he was back on Earth, disoriented, weakened, sprawled near the road outside Heber, Arizona. The craft was gone. Time itself had been erased. From his perspective, only hours had passed, but on Earth's measure, 5 days had vanished. Missing time, fractured and inexplicable, became the centerpiece of his paradox. When he returned to his family and colleagues, pale and gaunt, recounting fragments of sterile rooms, small beings, and overwhelming light, responses fractured again along familiar lines. Believers clung to the testimony as confirmation that humanity was indeed within reach of cosmic visitors. Skeptics contended otherwise. The human brain, stressed by trauma and hemmed by unconsciousness, could weave hallucinations so vivid that waking realities faltered. His memories, they said, reflected no extraterrestrials, but rather the scrambling dreams of a man stunned by electricity, fear, and exhaustion. Psychologists pointed to the archetypes at play. Small beings with enlarged heads resembled recurring symbols in folklore, filtered perhaps through modern science fiction. Alien abduction narratives fit seamlessly into cultural anxieties of the mid-1970s, when distrust of authority collided with fascination for space. Could Travis have internalized images from popular culture and exhaled them under duress? Could an episode of unconscious delirium explain sterile halls and silent, staring eyes? Yet for each skeptical attempt at dissection, believers countered with the emotional consistency of his retelling. Travis did not revel in fame. He shrank from it. His story brought ridicule as much as fascination, hardship as much as support. What, they asked, could he gain? His trembling embarrassment, his inner conflict, his reluctance at times to elaborate, all these painted him less as a performer and more as a man out of depth, haunted by something he wished he could forget. The imagery itself refuses easy closure. Sterile corridors, glowing walls, small silent beings, star fields glimpsed through alien craft. These linger like haunting verses of half-remembered dreams. Skeptics insist they are indeed dreams, stitched by stress and fueled by imagination. But believers see, in those very details, confirmation of a broader narrative carried across thousands of accounts worldwide. For Travis himself, it became a paradox without end. He maintained honesty in his recollections, yet admitted fogginess, lapses, and missing context. He did not claim mastery of his own story. Rather, he confessed bewilderment still tethered him decades later. And this humility, paradoxically, only deepened the conviction of those inclined to trust him. Looking back, one cannot separate the experience itself from the cultural ocean into which it fell. The 1970s brimmed with fascination toward UFOs. Possibilities danced in bookshops and late-night television specials. When Travis rose from his disoriented collapse near the roadway and described beings fitting this archetype, critics accused contamination. How could he not have absorbed the iconography of little gray aliens? Yet to his supporters, this resemblance reinforced universality, proof that disparate witnesses across decades were describing the same phenomenon. For the listener, and for the audience slipping toward rest, beneath the spell of this story, perhaps the most powerful truth is not whether these beings were real. Perhaps it is the simple recognition of contrast. A logger from a small Arizona town found himself swept into a sterile place where the ordinary dissolved, where silence reigned, and where beings, whether hallucination or higher intelligence, looked upon him with unreadable eyes. Could the mind alone conjure such vivid architecture? Could trauma mimic the sensation of wandering curved corridors and staring into endless stars? Or does his account suggest glimpses of knowledge humanity has not yet grasped? The answer remains uncertain, but the imagery Travis offered has outlived the shouting battles of skeptics and believers alike. His pale figures, his silent rooms, his domed chamber of stars, all persist, mesmerizing and unresolved in the annals of modern folklore. Whether you rest tonight seeing it as fiction or possibility, the imagery lingers with an inescapable pull, carrying us into the gentle rhythm of uncertainty itself. For some, it is dream. For others, a testimony of truth. For Travis Walton, it was memory he could never quite escape. And so, his tale aboard the craft closes quietly, hauntingly. An ordinary man waking to extraordinary light, surrounded by figures that rendered him fragile, carried briefly into halls that belonged to no human structure, then returned as if discarded, bewildered, forever changed. When Travis Walton reappeared alive after 5 days, confusion turned immediately into shock. Relief warmed his family and friends that he still breathed, but the sense of joy became tangled at once with disbelief, suspicion, and relentless curiosity. In Snowflake, Arizona, where daily life often passed in quiet cycles, his sudden return ignited a fire of attention so immense, it felt as though the town had been dropped into another dimension. One day, Travis was the missing logger, presumed dead in many whispered conversations. The next, he stumbled back into consciousness with tales of bright lights, sterile corridors, and beings unlike any ordinary men had ever seen. For his family, the miracle of survival mattered most. For the outside world, though, what mattered was whether the impossible story attached to his return could be believed. News spread like a spark leaping from branch to branch across dry forest. Local papers picked it up first, astonished reporters scribbling the outline of disappearance and reappearance. Within days, national outlets from coast to coast descended. Journalists and television crews found Snowflake, a town barely ready for strangers, suddenly lined with cameras and microphones. For the Walton family, there was no pause to breathe. Their kitchen became an unwilling briefing room. Their phones rang constantly. Curious onlookers even pressed against windows, hungry for some glimpse of the man whose absence and return became instant folklore. Travis himself was fragile, disoriented, gaunt, more bewildered than prepared to perform. His testimony leaked out, not as a polished monologue, but as fragments, confusion bleeding between sentences. He spoke of rooms glowing with sterile light, of small beings observing him, of taller and more human-like figures guiding him gently. His account fractured. Some details he could not recall clearly. Others pressed forward with vivid ease. For the media, this inconsistency was both scandal and treasure. Headlines sold better when mystery saturated truth. UFO researchers surged to his side almost immediately. For decades, they had collected whispered tales of lights in the sky, disappearances and reappearances, strange figures seen in darkness. Here, finally, was a case rich with witnesses. 6 men who had seen the beam, the craft, the fall. A family that had lived through his loss. Authorities who had chased him in vain across forested ridges. The case appeared ripe with credibility, and researchers promoted it as one of the most significant abduction accounts on record. They argued that the polygraphs supported the witnesses, that Travis's disorientation resembled trauma more than performance, and that the sheer lack of motive suggested since-pretty. But skeptics arrived with equal energy. Scientists and debunkers dissected every piece of evidence. To them, Travis's story bore all the hallmarks of hallucination or fabrication. They noted that he had grown up in the 1960s and 1970s, when cultural fascination with extraterrestrial life blossomed. Television programs, popular films, and tabloid magazines filled imaginations with images of humanoid figures and glowing craft. One skeptic pointed out that similarities between Travis's beings and those already popular in science fiction were too stark to ignore. Stress, exhaustion, or fantasy could have sculpted the imagery he later described. Skeptics also pointed to practical motives. Rogers's logging contract with the Forest Service had been behind schedule. Failure loomed. Some suggested the disappearance was a ploy to divert attention from looming penalty fees, an elaborate trick staged in collusion. Others whispered that Travis, always described as imaginative, might have seized an opportunity to step into the limelight. However messy that spotlight might become. For debunkers, explanations rooted in pressure and imagination offered far more comfort than the alternative of alien craft sweeping men from forests. The press tugged both ways. Some articles pressed suspicion, highlighting supposed contradictions in testimonies or lapses between early and later details. Others leaned into the sensational abduction in Arizona. The case of the missing logger returned from space. Headlines splashed in bold across pages that captured national attention. For readers in cities far from the Mogollon Rim, the tale offered a delicious tension, the ordinary colliding with the extraordinary, a logger colliding with light. Whether scoffing or believing, they consumed it feverishly. And this mood was larger than Travis himself. The 1970s had grown into fertile ground for UFO fascination. Only a few decades separated humanity from its first nuclear use, and the collective memory of the Cold War hummed in every household. Rockets had taken men to the moon only 6 years earlier. Technology galloped forward, and with it, anxieties about what might ascend from beyond. Government secrecy fed suspicion, declassified documents hinting at projects shrouded in shadow. To trust institutions in the mid-70s was, for many, an act of naivete. Into this charged atmosphere, Travis's story arrived like kerosene poured onto glowing embers. Television specials soon sought the story. Talk shows lined up interviews. Book publishers knocked at the Walton family's door. Meanwhile, skeptics sharpened pens, crafting critiques that branded the accounts as hoax or delusion. A culture increasingly split between credulous fascination and hard-edged doubt devoured each headline. It was not only Travis's credibility on trial, but humanity's ability to reckon with mystery while clinging to reason. For the crew members who had fled that clearing, life became even harsher. They never expected to find themselves celebrities of controversy, names printed beside words like liar or truth-teller. Some avoided questions altogether. Others repeated accounts so many times they grew weary. Men trained to swing saws and haul timber were suddenly cross-examined, like politicians. Radios buzzing with their denials, their sincerity debated by strangers thousands of miles away. Travis felt whiplash between relief and suffering. Surrounded now by distrust as much as sympathy, he struggled to return to normalcy. Sleep eluded him. When rest came, dreams were jagged, filled with sterile halls and looming silhouettes. In public, strangers approached, some with awe, some with ridicule. His testimony hung suspended between realms. Neither wholly believed nor wholly dismissed, it occupied an uncanny middle space that magnified its grip on popular imagination. Scientists wrote careful essays. Some argued his account resembled hypnagogic hallucinations, the vivid dreams people sometimes experience on the cusp between sleep and waking. Others suggested temporal lobe seizures could implanted imagery so real that memory accepted them as lived. But believers rebutted. How then to explain his absence for 5 days? How to explain 6 rugged men's trembling testimonies, their steady polygraph results, their unshaken insistence that a craft hovered in the clearing? Electricity or psychology alone, they suggested, could not erase physical presence for nearly a week. The case became a mirror. To those disposed toward wonder, it validated possibility. To those devoted to skepticism, it revealed gullibility. Each camp saw in Travis's return not a man, but a symbol, a canvas upon which to paint fears and hopes. He himself occupied neither fully. He hovered between, stating only what he recalled, admitting confusion where it persisted. For many, this reluctance to over-explain lent his testimony deeper resonance. Few hoaxers, after all, invite ambiguity. This was a period when fascination with unexplained phenomena permeated society at every level. Books documenting abductions stacked on shelves. Films imagined close encounters with vivid spectacle. Radio shows encouraged callers to share experiences of strange lights. The Walton case slotted perfectly into this cultural puzzle, resonating with audiences already intrigued, already willing, if cautiously, to entertain the unknown. The distrust of authority in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate heightened resonance further. If governments lied, if documents were buried, why should ordinary men's testimonies not hold more truth than official denials? Every rumor of hidden files, every admission of secrecy by military or intelligence officials gave Travis's story richer soil to root into. And so, in that cultural climate, skepticism and belief both thrive. For the soothing rhythm of reflection, we may pause to measure the strangeness of it all. A small-town logger, absent 5 days, ignited conversations across continents. From kitchen tables to lecture halls, from campfire debates to television studios, his name mingled with words like abduction and alien. Belief did not require proof. Doubt did not require dismissal. Rather, both coexisted, locked in friction, yet bound together by the same mysterious core. Ultimately, what the world saw in Travis Walton was not simply him, but itself. Humanity projected anxieties, aspirations, curiosities, and ridicule, each filtered through a young man's bewildering experience. Whether as cosmic contactee or rural trickster, he became emblematic of how people wrestle with mystery. Do we reach out in awe or fold arms in skepticism? Do we allow the extraordinary a foothold or insist always upon rational walls? If one quiet conclusion can be offered, it is this. The Walton case showed how the unknown serves as mirror more than wants and doubt. Those inclined toward wonder saw confirmation enough to keep watching skies. Those inclined toward doubt held firm that human imagination was vast, but not extraterrestrial. He, meanwhile, stood weary in the middle, a man both victim and spokesperson for an event he never fully understood. And so the world reacted, as worlds always do, by dividing, debating, and dreaming. Newspapers chased headlines. Researchers defended passions. Skeptics polished rebuttals. Families tried to shield themselves from brightness sharper than any beam. Through it all, beneath noise and argument, lay the simple human truth. 7 men went to work one day in the forest, and for one of them, life fractured into story forever, etched upon culture. The debates continue decades later, as lectures, documentaries, skeptics' essays, and believers' books maintain their tug-of-war. Yet to sit with Travis's story is not to resolve, but to rest in the possibility itself. Was it hallucination or visitation, trauma or contact? Humanity may never know. But the search itself, the debates, the newsprint, the whispers, belongs as much to our nature as wood smoke belongs to campfires. Travis's reappearance etched itself into the 1970s with permanence. And though opinions divided, one truth remained unshaken. His case revealed the era's heart. A period of distrust, fascination, and searching, encapsulated in the bewildered eyes of a man who said he walked among silent beings. When Travis Walton returned, alive but shaken, the celebration of his survival lasted only minutes before questions replaced it. The stunned joy of his family soon became drowned beneath waves of inquiry and accusation. His account, rich with sterile corridors and beings unlike humankind, was powerful to believers. But to many outsiders, it was provocative more for its improbability. Reports spiraled through media. Investigators pressed him and his companions. Skeptics sharpened analyses that they believed would unmask deception. The struggle for credibility, once begun, would come to define the case more than any single detail of his actual story. The polygraph stood at the heart of this battle. In 1975, lie detection was widely trusted by the public and law enforcement alike. Though experts debated its infallibility, communities often treated it as near science. For many, to pass meant an undeniable stamp of truth. To fail meant exposure, irredeemable. For the crew who had witnessed the beam, endured suspicion of murder, and clung to their account, the polygraph became a crucible. They would prove their innocence or collapse beneath disbelief. Under the direction of county officials, each of the 6 crew members, the men who had watched Travis fall, sat before examiners. Polygraph wires encircled their bodies, measuring breath, pulse, sweat, every nervous flutter. Questions pressed directly. Did you harm Travis Walton? Did you see a UFO? Did you conspire to lie? One by one, their responses were transcribed against trembling lines of ink. Days later, results emerged. Most pass. D. The machines suggested honesty on the most crucial questions. They did not harm him, did not kill him, did not conceal a body. Yet interpretation carried its own ambiguity. The stress of trauma, some examiners noted, might skew readings. Nervousness might mimic deception. Still, the margins leaned toward truthfulness. Almost all of the men's tests supported their story, rather than undermining it. A single exception complicated matters. One man's results came back inconclusive, flagged by erratic shifts that could mean deception, or simply nervous instability under stress. Skeptics seized upon this at once. Here was a fault line they could exploit. If one man's signals faltered, perhaps all had failed, and the story unraveled under scrutiny. Defenders, however, pointed to the overwhelming majority, arguing that nearly unanimous verification was itself extraordinary. Polygraphs, of course, are not perfect. Even then, their weaknesses were known. Nervousness could muddy waters. Bias in examiners could tilt outcomes. Yet, in that specific cultural moment, people invested immense trust in the lines scrawled across charts. For believers, the crew's near-unanimous passing was decisive. For skeptics, the single inconclusive result was crack enough to pry open. Thus, the same tests were hailed both as proof of truth and as evidence of deception. Travis himself underwent subsequent polygraphs. Results varied, some indicating honesty, others muddied by anxiety. A particularly aggressive examiner claimed falsification outright, his tone framing his report with skepticism. UFO researchers countered, alleging bias in the questioning methods, and noting that intensely hostile testing could itself skew outcomes. Later retests under less confrontational circumstances leaned toward supporting Travis's sincerity. The results shifted with context, leaving the matter unsettled. This back and forth ignited a storm. Skeptics saw polygraphs not as allies of UFO witnesses, but as weapons for dismantling credibility. Defenders saw them as necessary steps toward validity. Each side hurled interpretations across the public square, comfortably ignoring any ambiguities inconvenient to their positions. Meanwhile, ordinary spectators followed the soap opera with fascination. Newspaper columns debated whether the machines confirmed an alien abduction or revealed small-town liars playing a hoax. Talk shows invited both camps, pitting analysts against UFO researchers, in verbal duels, thinly disguised as interviews. Audiences consumed it all the way people consume a mystery thriller, waiting not for resolution, but for the next twist. And there were many twists. On one hand, the crew's consistent testimonies and their ability to survive intense scrutiny without splintering suggested sincerity. On the other, skeptics asked why physical evidence was lacking. No photographs, no burns on soil, no scorched trees. Believers answered that not all encounters left hard traces. Sometimes presence itself dissolved cleanly into air. Skeptics responded with dry smiles, convenient for storytellers, but unsatisfying to science. Within UFO research circles, the Walton case rose instantly to the rank of classic. Researchers labeled it a landmark in abduction history, citing the multiple witnesses, the missing time, the physical trauma Travis claimed when returning gaunt and disoriented. For them, the polygraph drama strengthened support. Men under enormous suspicion had submitted to invasive questioning, and their words, broadly verified, moved the account from the margins of folklore into a foundation of their archive. Debunkers, however, rallied with vigor. Writing for skeptical journals and popular magazines, they proposed alternate explanations. Travis, they suggested, had hidden in secrecy during the missing 5 days, sustaining himself quietly while planning details of his story. Others claimed he had simply fled confusion, seeking refuge until the search frenzy subsided, then returned with grandiose tales. Theories ranged. Even accusations of drug use surfaced, though never substantiated. No detail of his life went unprodded, each memory twisted to serve predetermined conclusions. The drama became less about Travis himself and more about the tug-of-war between belief and disbelief that defined the cultural fabric of the 1970s. On one side, ufologists eager for validation. On the other, experts eager to reassert the reign of empirical doubt. Neither camp relented. What made the Walton case endure through decades was not victory for one or the other, but precisely the stalemate. Tests showed honesty, but not perfectly. Travis offered testimony, but imperfectly. Skeptics tore holes, but could not close the wound entirely. The result was balance, a paradox humming like static across generations. For those comfortable resting in the middle, this paradox is perhaps the truest part of the story. The world rarely divides neatly into lies and truths. Our experiences often straddle. What matters most is not whether machines confirmed honesty without question, but that the human drama exposed yearning. The yearning to know, to prove, to defend what one experienced against the stone walls of doubt. The polygraph drama illustrated that vividly. Imagine sitting in that chair, wires encasing your chest, a stranger demanding yes or no, truth or lie. Your body quivers from trauma, breath uneven, heart swollen with panic. Even the attempt to answer steadily tests your edges. Could you retain composure? Would your chart lines behave? The men who underwent that ordeal believed at heart they were telling truth. Machines mostly agreed. Yet because answers were imperfect, suspicion remained. This points to something deeper. The limits of tools we use to measure human truth. Lie detectors offered the illusion of certainty, but their results only added more chapters to confusion. Instead of silence, they birthed louder argument. Instead of resolution, more questions. Ultimately, the polygraph's place in the Travis Walton case captures the entire phenomenon. Everyone desired clarity, proof of abduction, or proof of hoax. What they received was ambiguity, dressed in charts. Clarity proved elusive, and so the debate continued. Believers declared victory. Skeptics claimed triumph. Both looked toward the public court for validation. In truth, both won and both lost, because neither could close the rift. Even today, mention of polygraph tests pulses across any discussion of the Walton case. Skeptics summarize them as unreliable, defenders as corroboration. With decades of hindsight, we may view both interpretations as expected. Each camp needed the results to fit its worldview. They bent them, twisted them, justified them. But the strain of that tug of war revealed where the power of the case truly resided. Not in polygraphs alone, but in the human inability to rest in uncertainty. The Walton family's suffering added weight to this. It was never a game for them. While debaters filled journals and conferences, they endured ridicule in their own community. Brothers defended Travis fiercely. Neighbors whispered doubts. For his mother, each headline carried pangs. For his brothers, each sneer carved fresh wounds. The family stood by him, insisting sincerity, enduring social strain that skeptics did not always account for in their analyses. For Travis, the polygraph drama only deepened isolation. Strangers reduced him to charts and scores, pass or fail, hoax or truth, ignoring that he was not a concept, but a person suspended between confusing memories and public ridicule. He cooperated with tests, revisited memories, spoke reluctantly when pressed. He found little comfort in results, whichever direction they leaned. For him, the alienation grew heavier than alien imagery itself. The defenders continued, though, lifting him as emblem of humanity's potential brush with cosmic otherness. They wrote lengthy books dissecting each polygraph question, pointing out consistencies across testimonies, lauding the courage of ordinary men who stood against ridicule. This narrative cast Travis as reluctant hero, not fraud. The doubters matched them with equal passion. They published counter-studies, dissected contradictions, highlighted the inconclusive result of one crew member like a hammer striking nails. Their narrative cast Travis as opportunist, not experiencer. And still the story lived in between. The world could not conclude decisively, so culture itself became the battleground. Films and television dramatized it. Researchers spoke of it reverently in conferences. Skeptics mocked it vigorously at cocktail parties and academic debates. The case endured precisely because the contradiction could not be resolved with finality. This is why Travis's story matters. Not because polygraphs proved him true or exposed him false. They did neither. But because the tension between doubt and defense mirrors the human condition when faced with the unknown. Skeptics represent the mind-craving structure. Believers, the heart-craving wonder. Travis's case provided the perfect storm, where both instincts collided, exploding not into resolution, but into decades of steady fascination. The polygraph drama stands as symbolic. It tells us that truths living at the frontier between possible and impossible cannot be captured easily by wires and charts. They demand patience, reflection, humility before uncertainty. Whether you lean toward doubt or lean toward defense, you may find yourself circling back to the clearing where a man fell under radiant light and was gone, leaving only companions to testify and machines to flounder at detecting truth. The final verdict lies not within tests, but within each witness of the story. For some, the needle of belief swings toward, yes, he spoke honestly. For others, it swings toward hoax. For most, it floats endlessly in between, a restless balance mirroring the paradox of existence itself. And so, as with each element of the Walton encounter, the debate over polygraphs and honesty leads not to discovery, but to reflection. Could ordinary men fabricate such a tale under pressure? Could machines measure complex human truth? Could one man's memories of light and silence tell us about extraterrestrial intelligence, or only about the fragility of human mind under trauma? The answers dissolve into fog. But what remains stable is the paradox itself, which has given the story endurance far longer than simpler tales. The polygraph drama has become less about results than about the way humanity responds to unsolvable questions. Not with closure, but with persistence, doubt, belief, and wonder, all interwoven into the most enduring abduction case in modern history. The story of Travis Walton did not end with his return, nor with the interrogations, the polygraphs, or the heated debates. In truth, those moments were only the beginning of his strange place in cultural memory. Over the decades, his experience has echoed far beyond the forests of Arizona, weaving itself into books, films, lectures, and late-night whispers beneath starlit skies. Whether embraced as truth or dismissed as fabrication, the story continues to live, an enduring mystery that refuses to fade quietly. In the years immediately after his ordeal, Walton remained reserved. He returned to family and tried to reclaim fragments of normal life, but the intense attention never left. Invitations from UFO organizations, interviewers, and producers arrived faster than he could refuse them. He eventually chose to document his story, first privately, later in print, offering a narrative that he hoped might anchor what felt adrift in rumor and conflict. His book, The Walton Experience, gave him a voice on his own terms. It described not only the sterile rooms aboard the craft, but also the turmoil afterward, the accusations, the tests, the sleepless nights. Readers devoured it, whether out of belief or to study its strangeness, and for many, it solidified his case as a cornerstone of abduction lore. Hollywood soon pressed its mark. In 1993, a film titled Fire in the Sky dramatized his case, turning the logging crew's experience into cinematic spectacle. Though the film diverged from Travis's testimony in many places, its abduction sequence envisioned with grotesque horror rather than sterile awe, it embedded his name into public awareness for generations. Moviegoers who had never read UFO journals or studied polygraph transcripts still remember the image of a man seized by otherworldly beings. Travis himself criticized the distortions, yet understood the paradox. Hollywood's excess also ensured permanence. Today, many know his name first through the film, before discovering his actual account. Beyond cinema, his story became a touchstone for UFO researchers. Conferences dedicated entire panels to dissecting the Walton case, hailing it as one of the best documented and most dramatic abductions in modern history. They cited multiple witnesses, consistent testimonies, and near-unanimous polygraphs as extraordinary. Even skeptics, while dismissing it, admitted its endurance as one of the most famous cases. The case appeared in encyclopedias of unexplained phenomena, in guides to abduction research, and in countless radio and television programs devoted to the strange. Its survival through decades illustrates not only fascination with extraterrestrial life, but also the grip of a mystery that refuses eviction once it has settled deeply into collective imagination. For Travis himself, speaking about the experience became both a burden and responsibility. He traveled to conferences, occasionally gave interviews, and often voiced his lingering sense of humility. He did not claim mastery over the truth of what happened. He remained careful with details, never fully embellishing or reimagining beyond what he remembered. This restraint lent his words credibility to some, though Skeptics parried that inconsistency only reflected weakness of invention. In either framing, his position seemed the same, reluctant carrier of an enduring mystery. Decades after the disappearance, he remains tied irrevocably to that November evening. In interviews, his eyes still reveal memory's weight. He has spoken of the cost, the suspicion, the ridicule, the way strangers casually mock what for him is a never-ending wound. He has also spoken of the comfort, the fellowship found with others who claim experiences, the kinship of a community that finds in him not a fraud, but a pioneer. For him, the case ranks as both curse and strange gift, a life forever altered, stripped of anonymity, but sustained through a legacy that continues. What his story reveals most vividly, perhaps, is not the encounter itself, but how society reacts to mystery. A single event split lives into camps of belief and disbelief. Friends defended him with passion. Neighbors doubted with cynicism. Media dramatized and twisted. Researchers positioned him as proof. Skeptics wielded him as warning. Yet across all of these interpretations, what endured was less whether he truly boarded an alien craft, and more what people did with the enduring possibility of it. That paradox, haunting but calm, carries a kind of comfort. Humanity has always leaned toward mysteries without resolution. Folklore survives not because it is proven, but because it remains unsolved. Ghost stories drift through generations, not because evidence compels belief, but because uncertainty offers companionship. And in Travis Walton's tale, listeners find precisely that companionship, an open-ended possibility that hovers over the line splitting earth from sky. For many, his story became not frightening, but reassuring. If beings exist beyond us, then perhaps humanity's solitude in the universe is less absolute. If contact has happened, even in one Arizona clearing, then the cosmos is more inhabited, more dynamic, more astonishing than we dared calculate. Others find comfort in dismissing his account, reminding themselves that the order of science remains intact, that no strange glow will intrude upon their evening walks. Either way, comfort arises, not from answering, but from deciding personally how to stand before the unknown. Culturally, the Walton case also reminds us of who tells history. Scientists and skeptics preserve skepticism as part of discipline. Believers preserve stories as part of faith. Films preserve emotion, dramatizing horror or wonder according to audience appetite. The actual people, the loggers, the families, are sometimes left behind, their pain lost beneath layers of echo. Yet, their voices, particularly Travis's own, are what secured the story's persistence. He never proclaimed it solved. He simply repeated what he remembered. It lingers, not because he declared it definitive, but because he admitted he could not force it to align neatly with resolution. This ambiguity made the case fertile ground for reflection in wider culture. The Walton case often appears alongside Roswell, Rendlesham, and the experiences of Betty and Barney Hill in this pantheon of enigmatic accounts. It holds a distinctive place. Unlike Roswell, it revolved not around hidden fragments of alleged craft, but human testimony and human survival. Unlike Rendlesham, it unfolded in deep wilderness, not on military bases. Unlike the Hill abduction, it involved multiple witnesses to an initial event. Each comparison only strengthens its uniqueness. For ufologists, that uniqueness provides defense. This was not a lone dreamer or military rumor, but an ensemble account involving 7 men. For skeptics, the same uniqueness sharpened suspicion. 7 connected men, easily pressured, made ideal collaborators in fabrication. Both sides used the very same circumstances to justify opposite conclusions. This paradox embedded the Walton story firmly in cultural debate. Modern audiences, too, continue to embrace the mystery. Podcasts dissect his case with careful pacing, voices soothing and curious in equal measure. Documentary series revisit Arizona's forests, standing in the clearing where beams once blazed. Younger generations, unburdened by 1970s urgency, listen with equal skepticism and fascination, enjoying the case as both history and myth. What emerges is neither closure nor dismissal, but a sense of continuing relevance. The story feels alive because it remains unanswered. For those drifting toward rest with such storytelling, here lies the secret gift of encounters that resist resolution. They create space for imagination. While muscles soften under blankets, while breaths slow, the mind can travel to Arizona pines, to glowing corridors, to debates unfolding across decades. The unanswered story does not chase us with horror, but invites us to wander at our own pace. As listeners fall gradually toward sleep, they drift alongside this mystery, neither clinging to certainty nor rejecting wonder. Travis himself has aged, but interviews reveal the rare paradox of a man forever young in one particular narrative. He is always the 22-year-old logger walking toward light. No matter his current age, culture will immortalize him frozen in that clearing, stepping into the glow. This, too, is a kind of echo. Personal time moves forward, but myth fixes him eternally in place. That is perhaps the strangest element of legacy. People become characters, their lived details reduced to folklore, and yet the echo carries, even when concrete memories fade. From Arizona's rim country to conferences in Europe and television screens worldwide, his name endures. A life fractured once by life became symposium topic, book subject, screenplay fodder, and whispered bedtime story. And in all this, the comfort persists. Mysteries need not conclude. They can rest, softly unresolved, as companions in the dark. Perhaps the truest legacy is reflection itself. Did Travis Walton really spend days aboard a craft not of Earth? Or did shock, stress, and cultural pressure weave hallucination into memory? Each person may answer differently, and their answers say as much about themselves as about him. Belief becomes an act of identity. Doubt becomes reassurance of control. Neither dissolves the mystery, and so the story survives exactly because it resists solution. Tonight, PE wraps. Countless eyes lift toward stars, imagining lights that may or may not conceal intelligent craft. Perhaps someone remembers Travis Walton's name, or a fragment of an article, or a stray mention of a film. They ponder for a moment, then move on, yet the spark remains inside. That is how folklore thrives, not by commanding constant focus, but by embedding itself invisibly, surfacing in quiet instants time and again. In the end, the Walton case stands not as solved mystery, but as living echo. An echo of November winds through pine needles. An echo of voices shouting in terror as a man fell. An echo of silence inside sterile corridors. An echo of debate between skeptics and defenders. An echo now stretching through decades, settling gently into the space between belief and disbelief. And so, as listeners drift between waking and sleep, they may carry the image with them. A dark forest, a glow pulsing softly, a young man stepping forward. Whether truth or dream, hoax or encounter, the story settles into quiet question. What lies beyond human sight? What memories remain true when they are unprovable? What corridors might stretch beyond the stars, waiting for someone somewhere to walk their paths? There is no need to decide tonight. The legacy is in not knowing, in resting with possibility. Some stories conclude in evidence, others conclude in silence, and some never conclude at all, echoing forever in memory's twilight. Travis Walton's story is one of the latter. For decades it has whispered in humanity's ear, promising nothing guaranteed, but delivering something just as powerful, the comfort of wonder.